We've been talking with you quite a bit about extremist sects within religions. And I want to call your attention back to an interview we did on December 19th of 2011. This is a great interview with Rachel Tabachnick, a researcher and writer, about the impact of what's called the New Apostolic Reformation and Dominion theology within right-wing Christianity. We've talked a lot about ISIS and extremist movements within Islam, and I think it's important just to remind ourselves of what was a very, very interesting interview that we had with Rachel Tabachnick back in 2011. So that is this week's interview, classic interview of the week. Rachel Tabachnick is a researcher, writer, and speaker on issues pertaining to the impact of the religious right on policy and politics. Great to speak with you, Rachel.
Thank you.
So let's start at the beginning here. Tell me a little bit about NAR. What do those letters stand for, and what is this movement?
New Apostolic Reformation. This is a movement that's really growing in the religious right. It's led by self-pronounced apostles and prophets, and is dramatically changing both the structure of many churches that form what we would call the larger religious right or evangelical right, and also much of the ideology of these churches and ministries. The major factor about this movement is that they believe that they have to take dominion over government and society before Jesus can return, which is a very different idea than has been popular in American fundamentalism for many generations, where it was believed that the true believers would be taken from the earth before the end of time and before Jesus' return.
Right, so that latter part would kind of be like this rapture idea, right? Which is
Yes,
at a certain
exactly.
point, there will be a selection made, so to speak, and some people will be able to live for eternity, presumably, in heaven, and then everybody else will perish. Is that roughly accurate?
That's roughly accurate. And of course, in that scenario, all of the really terrible end time wars and so forth take place after the believers have been raptured to heaven.
Of course.
This scenario is quite different. In this scenario, the believers are still on earth as these things are happening. So I think this is part of what's adding to what we could say the end times hysteria that we are seeing in parts of society. So the believers will be left on the earth in order to fight evil and to fight the Antichrist themselves. So part of this change with the New Apostolic Reformation is the idea that these believers must take control over society and government themselves before Jesus can return. And this is encapsulated in a concept called the Seven Mountains. So the idea is that these believers must take over arts, business, education, family, government, media, and religion.
And before I get to the Rick Perry connection to all of this, I have a kind of a more historical question for you, which is how far back can we identify these kind of end time prophecies in history? I mean, we certainly know that for at least a couple of thousand years we've experienced them, but do these date really far back? I mean, can we find evidence of the end time prophecies much further back in human existence?
Well, we certainly find Christian end times prophecy dating back many hundreds of years as part of the Crusades and other historical events. Now, in terms of American, specifically American fundamentalist end time ideas, there's a narrative that dates back about 150 years, the narrative that we were discussing about the believers being raptured before the end. Now, the shift that we're talking about, a dramatic shift in American end times theology, has taken place, let's say, over about the last 30 to 40 years. And I would say accelerating rapidly in the last 10 to 15 years to what we call dominionism, or this belief that this particular brand of Christianity must take control over society and government. That is dominionism.
And tell us about the Rick Perry connection to all of this.
Well, this became news after Rick Perry's August 6th prayer event in Houston, Texas called The Response. And the reason it did is that a large number of these apostles and prophets, national and international leaders in the movement, were part of the event. Others were there that were not visible on camera. And the event was organized by two major New Apostolic organizations, one called The Call, headed by a prophet, Lou Engle, and the other, the International House of Prayer, led by Mike Bickle, who also led a substantial part of that prayer event.
So IHOP, in other words, we could say.
IHOP, yes, the other IHOP.
Yeah.
And there are International House of Prayers now popping up around the globe and in cities across America.
So it's a chain, so to speak.
Yes. In some ways, it is. They are interconnected. They live stream from the main IHOP in Kansas City, where The Call is also based.
Incredible. And so Rick Perry has not really, other than we covered that prayer event back when it was going on, Rick Perry has not really made any of this, of his involvement in any of this very clear during his kind of more mainstream presidential campaigns, has he? Or is it there in ways that maybe just aren't that clear to the average news viewer?
Well, there are ways that might not be so clear. For instance, an IHOP leader in Florida was chosen as part of Rick Perry's campaign there and so forth. But I think what has happened is that Rick Perry has been a spectacular failure as a candidate at the national level in ways that were not anticipated by the movement. And so I think that the support has not been as apparent because Rick Perry's campaign has not gone very far. However, keep in mind that these same, a lot of the same organizations, a lot of the same money behind Rick Perry's event are behind what's called United in Purpose, Champion the Vote, which has been holding pastors' policy briefings around the country for years. And another regular feature in these policy briefings is Newt Gingrich. So now we've seen Newt Gingrich take a turn in sort of the Republican candidate merry-go-round that's been taking place. And perhaps some of the boost that Newt Gingrich got came from the extensive exposure that he's had through these pastors' policy briefings, which have been held in states across the nation, and particularly in Iowa, South Carolina, and Florida over the last several years.
When you talk about the goal of taking over family and education and government, et cetera, tell me a little bit about what are some of the methods. I mean, does the takeover involve kind of a strategic, thought-out process? Is it potentially a violent type of takeover of these areas? I mean, how far does this movement potentially go?
Well, let me stress that perhaps the major architect of the movement in the United States, C. Peter Wagner, states that there does not have to be any type of violent overthrow. And in fact, he doesn't like to use the word theocratic. He says that this can be done inside of completely democratic means, just by the growth of the movement and growth of popularity of the movement. So in other words, he's saying that if the movement becomes large enough and the outreach is effective enough, then they can take this control just through voting at democratic means and taking over policy and the structure in these 7 mountains.
Absolutely. And do you expect that with any of the candidates who, I mean, I would assume Mitt Romney is not a part of this in any way. He has a completely different religious background, being a Mormon. But if Gingrich does end up being the nominee, and correct me if I'm wrong on Romney, but if Gingrich ends up being the nominee, do you expect we'll see more allusions to this type of thought in the mainstream?
Two questions there. First of all, you are not incorrect about Romney.
Okay.
Mormons are not considered to be Christians by this movement unless they have actually been evangelized. The movement has worked with some Mormon candidates, for instance, in Hawaii, but these are people who are considered to be evangelized to their form of belief.
Right.
And on the other point, I think what we will see, let's say if Gingrich does become the candidate, I think we will see a lot of organizing. It may not be apparent to the general public, but a lot of organizing and promotion of Gingrich through the existing networks. The New Apostolic Reformation has what they call prayer warrior networks in all 50 states. They're much better developed in some states than others. But if you look back at 2008, when Sarah Palin was named as the vice presidential candidate and had close ties to the movement, there was an enormous amount of networking and promotion of Palin that went on behind the scenes throughout this 50-state network of the New Apostolic Reformation.
All right, well, there it is. Rachel Tabachnick, researcher, writer, speaker. Obviously, incredible work you're doing here on the religious right and exposing this stuff. So thanks so much for joining us. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.